And welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm your co-host, Ron Morgan, along with fellow co-host Kit Culver. Our goal for each episode each week is to take you on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible, growing and edifying the body. This is the 28th episode in our Journey Through the Scripture series. For those new to the podcast, our discussion format each week will be to respond to discussion questions embedded at the bottom of the study notes document. You can find these linked in the podcast description box. In the same box, you'll also find a link to our website, roadfromemmaus.com, where we share a bit about ourselves, the genesis for our podcast name, provide several helpful resources to help you dig further into redemptive history, no matter where you are in your journey. From time to time, Kit and I will also respond to direct questions that you pose as listeners. You can contact us at contact@roadfromemmaus.com. That's contact@roadfromemmaus.com. Before we jump in, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit that bell for notifications so you always know when we upload new content. We drop a new episode every Monday, so we look forward to you taking this exciting ride with us through the scriptures. Over the last several weeks, as we've talked about too, we've moved away from Sinai. We've actually started to deepen our understanding of what is Israel becoming and who are they unto the Lord. And one of the big things that we've talked about too, and Kit will jump into this in a little bit, is this idea of monarchy has started to emerge too, as this idea of a new governance, of new oversight for these people and how they're interacting with God, but more importantly, how they view themselves in relationship to the Lord and like the larger community that they're a part of too. And so we're going to dig into that a little bit more today. As we jump in, one of the first things we really want to wrestle with is what factors, circumstantial and psychological, motivated Israel's insistence on a human king. And if a human king was part of God's eternal desire and plan for Israel, why did their yearning incur his disapproval and judgment?
Well, the first thing to remember is that this time period that we're addressing today, where Israel gets its first king, the nation becomes a monarchy in that sense. This is the climax of the period of the judges. And we spent, I think, at least one episode talking about that era and how it was characterized by this increasing fracturing among the people of Israel and this cyclical pattern in which you had the nation continually kind of wandering from God, getting more kind of embroiled in the Canaanite peoples among them, and God then bringing them into a situation of subjugation and oppression where they then cried out to him. He sent them a judge who was a deliverer, a ruler for them, but also a redeemer in that sense, someone who liberated them from this oppression within the land. But in the book of Judges, there is this summary assessment of the people of Israel who are living in the land. They have inherited this place. They've been settled according to their tribal inheritances. And yet the assessment of them is that at that time there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And we talked about the fact that there's kind of a double meaning in that. Yes, it's true. There was no king in Israel. They were ruled by judges throughout that period. But the larger idea is that thing of every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so the point is that Yahweh, the Lord God, the covenant God, was king in Israel. The covenant with Israel had established them as a kingdom concerning which God himself was king. And so the point that's being made in the Judges is not just that there was no human king, although that was true, but that God himself was not functionally in the minds and the hearts of the people their king. He was not functioning as their king. Every man was his own king. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so it's kind of an interesting way of pointing to this fundamental way in which the people of Israel were living in contradiction of the covenant. They were not living as the people of God under his kingship, even though he was continuing to arise and deliver them and bring them judges. And these judges were ruling over them in a sense, but everybody was still very much operating as his own authority. And that's the context in which now you have the people of Israel coming and asking for a king. There had been no king, but they're seeking a king, but a king according to a certain mindset, a certain expectation. And as we're going to see, they're seeking a king who will be a king according to their own interests, their own sense of what a king should be. No concern for this king in relation to Yahweh as their king, but they want to be like the other nations.
Yeah, like we even see maybe a parallel even in like our own communities and like our own country where people often side, right? Like with the party or have allegiances, right? But at the end of the day, when we dig a little bit deeper, those things end up being self-serving, right? In other words, I subscribe to this party or I subscribe to this denomination because at the end of the day, it actually promotes and serves my self-interest too. Is from your perspective and even understanding, was Israel deeply aware of even what they were asking for and the implications of the ask unto the Lord and how these things would actually meet his disapproval?
Well, it's hard to say whether initially they were kind of consciously aware of what they were doing. Obviously, the scripture writers were aware of the significance of what they were asking, but very soon it will become obvious to them because as soon as they ask for a king, Samuel's going to confront them with the fact that what this represents is their actual rejection of Yahweh as their king. So it will become evident to them, and yet the whole project will go forward. And interestingly, this one thing that unites the people, which is this desire for a king, is itself expressive of their fragmentation as a people. In other words, every man is operating in his own right, but part of this thing of operating in their own right in violation of this covenant unity that God has established is that they can together agree as independent individual self-seeking men that it would be great to be like the nations around us and have a king like they have a king and be a nation in that sort of a sense. And so the same kind of natural thinking that has alienated them from one another and even produced wars among them, they come together with that wrongful and ultimately destructive mindset
Mhm.
that we would like to have a king. And that is something that we see throughout human history. The
Tower
one
of
thing that will
Babel.
bring people together in their autonomy and their independence, their estrangement from one another and from God, is a like cause that in their minds seems to be helpful, but ultimately, serves to their detriment.
Yeah, I was even thinking Tower of Babel, like this has
Right.
vestiges. And just as soon as
Exactly.
you said that, like my mind harkened back to that, where it's like, well, wait a minute, what's wrong with these people unifying and wanting to gather together and showing solidarity? And once
Right.
again, as we really dig into and we really get into the roots of those things, we realize that those things are dangerous and subversive too. And at the end of the day, that these people are self-serving at the core, even if on the surface these things look very affirming, right? Like, why would we not support that? And Kid, I think we see that with like a lot of organizations. We see that with a lot of interests, even in our current society, where on the surface, those things seem noble and well intentioned too, but at the end of the day, they fundamentally support estrangement and alienations and like further those causes.
Right. And
Um,
bear their bad fruit.
Absolutely, indeed. Uh, Considering how the various dimensions of Israel's unfaithfulness converge in the pinnacle expression of unbelief and rebellion, Kit, speak a little bit to this idea of introducing a form of governance that was both new and common at the same time, too. And even in our kind of pre-discussion before we got on, you and I talked about like that new element and that common element almost kind of are a unique dynamic in themselves. Speak to that a little bit.
Well, I mean, first we can say, okay, if maybe getting even behind that point, you note in the first question that God's intent, the scriptures make clear that God's intent was ultimately that he would have a human king who would preside over his people and ultimately preside over his creation. Well, why does he find fault then with them seeking a human king? And it's because of the kind of king that they want. God's intent was that ultimately he would have a human king, but of a certain sort, with a certain mindset, who rules in a certain way. And what the people are seeking is a king after their own heart, if we could put it that way, a king who will be the sort of man that they seek, the sort of man that will fulfill their own longings and their own expectations. And it's in that dynamic that we see how this new form of governance for Israel is both new and common. It will be new for them in that, once again, what the covenant did, the covenant that God ratifies, this relationship, this Abrahamic relationship that he ratified with them at Sinai, it established a kingdom in which God was king. And yes, he would be governing them through human agents, initially Moses, and then Joshua, and then the judges. But these were all extensions of his rule. They were extensions of his mind, his will. In other words, they were rulers who were ruling in God's authority according to his will, according to God's name. What they're now going to have is a human king or a human ruler who will not be an extension of God's rule, a king who will reflect this idea, as we said, that there is no divine ruler in Israel, that every man does what is right in his own eyes. Well, that's the way kingship and rule, that's the way authority operates in the world. And so what Israel's wanting is to be like the nations, to have a form of governance that is common in the ancient world, common even in some sense in the modern world. So it's a new kind of governance. It's a departure from the covenant structure of God as king, but it's also it's a common form of governance in that they want to be like the nations. And this is associated even with that idea of the procedure of the king.
Right.
God tells them, I will give you a king, and it really doesn't matter who you pick or who you ultimately anoint. Let me tell you what that king will be like, and what the procedure of the king involves is this man will use his power and his authority, his prerogative to serve his own ends. And so Samuel tells the people, you want a human king, this is what it will be like. I don't care who you pick. He's going to take your young men to fight his wars and enlarge his empire. And so you'll be cannon fodder. Obviously, they didn't have cannons then, but there'll be fodder for the sword and for the lances, as he seeks to establish his own power and enlarge his kingdom. He'll take your daughters to bake his bread and clean his palace, and he'll take the produce of your fields and gather it into his house for his servants, for his table. And so essentially, he's going to use his power to exploit you for his own ends. And this is the nature of human power throughout history. Whether you're talking about very ancient civilizations, or the Greeks, or the Romans, or the nations around Israel, the Middle Eastern, and even to the modern day. Jesus put it as the rulers call themselves benefactors, but they really lord it over you. And we see that even in contemporary democratic governments, right? Oh, yes, these are governments of the people, by the people, for the people. Well, no, they really serve themselves and their own agendas. And they tell you what you want to hear to get elected, but then they do what they want. and they serve their own bank accounts and their own power. And this is the way human governance always operates. So that's the commonality of this new form of governance that Israel seeks. Yes, when they abandon Yahweh as their king, they will be like the nations, but that means that they will have rulers who will rule according to the procedure of the king, and it will work to their detriment and ultimately to their destruction.
Yeah, like I think some of our listeners may be wondering, and I'm even going to elevate it on their behalf. I want to be super clear here, so we stamp this for them. Even going back to creation, we see that God Himself instituted and affirmed government, right? Even like the
Right.
creational framework, right? For every single, we spent several weeks on this. For every single realm, there was like a appointed ruler overseeing those realms, and then man oversaw those realms and those rulers too. Is if that is true, we are not saying under any certain terms that God is rejecting the concept of government, which He Himself has created. What we're saying is it is the heart and intention of the Israelites in terms of their desire for new governance for the king that He is finding fault with. I just want to make sure we stamp that. And could you clarify that just a little bit more?
Sure. Well, again, everything takes us back to God's intention for his creation. And we see in Genesis 1 and 2, as you just spoke, God's design is for a kingdom that he presides over as the sovereign Lord, as the sovereign king, as a father, but ruling through his image children. So you see in the creation account all of the, as you said, these realms of authority or dominion that have lords that rule over them. And over all of that is man, who is the image son, who administers the creator God and Father's lordship in the world. That's God's design. That's the creational kingdom that he had in mind at the beginning and that he's working towards. But that governance is God's own governance through his human creatures, who are really the way in which his mind, his will, his interests, his perspective is carried out in the world. Not human beings governing in their own right, exercising their dominion independently and autonomously. And this is what we saw with the fall, the delusion, the deception that man can be Lord over the world in his own right. And this is what we see happening in Israel. Every man does what is right in his own eyes. Every man is effectively his own king, his own Lord, his own ruler. And so what is being rejected here is the structure of governance, the form of governance, the form of kingdom, that God intends, and that Israel was to model in the world unto the final design of God, to sum up everything under the kingship of the Messiah, who is that image son, in whom the Father's mind and will and heart and rule are administered in the world, in the creation that he's ordered. So all of this harkens back to, again, the form of governance, the form of human governance, the human kingship that God intends. But what people seek is not that. What people in their estranged, autonomous, alienated condition, what they seek, even if they do it in the name of a deity or in the name of God, it's never that. And Israel is not seeking to be rid of God. They want to see God's rule carried out in the way that they think it should be carried out, that would make them be like the nations around them.
Why did Israel's unique status as God's covenant people not guarantee their distinction among the nations, nor their full devotion to and dependence upon their covenant Lord?
Well, I think we've kind of spoken to that, but again, when God brought Israel to Sinai, if our listeners recall, he entered into this transaction of ratifying this covenant relationship with them by reminding them who he was and who they were in relation to him, and that if they would keep this covenant, if they would fulfill that relationship, then they would be to him a kingdom of priests They would be a royal priesthood. In other words, they would be the kind of kingdom that he intended. And that priestly dimension of that would be that as they would be this sort of kingdom, this sort of royal people, distinguished from the rest of the nations, then they would be, through that faithfulness, mediating the knowledge of God to the other nations around them. It was precisely going to be that distinction from the nations that would be the means by which God would bring the nations back to himself. But the problem, as we've seen over and over again, is that Israel could not be that kind of covenant son, that kind of people, because they were just as alienated from God as the rest of the nations were. Yes, he had called them in Abraham. Yes, he had chosen them. Yes, he had appointed them to be this instrument. They were to be this image son for the sake of the world, but they were not able to fulfill that election. They were not able to fulfill that calling. And so the fact that they were God's unique, distinguished covenant people amongst all the peoples of the earth, um, that in itself did not ensure that they would end up fulfilling their calling. And here, where they are seeking to be just like the rest of the nations, they're effectively saying, we don't want to fulfill our vocation. Our distinction is to show you, Yahweh, and your kingdom and your ways to the rest of the nations. We want to be like the nations, which in terms of their own condition before God, their own fallen condition, they were just like the nations. But God called them out to be a light to the nations. But they said, no, we want to be just like the rest of the people. Well, that means now that they can't fulfill their role in the world because they are not this kind of image son as you have it here, in full devotion and dependence on the covenant Lord. So even in this seeking of a king, we have another exclamation point on the fact that Israel cannot be Israel. It cannot fulfill its covenant election and calling to be the light of the nations.
Israel's desire for a king continued its pattern of unfaithfulness, as we've obviously kind of rehashed and deepened a little bit over the last several minutes, Kit. But Yahweh granted it because it served his ends. In what way does this portion of salvation, history, demonstrate two things? One, God's unwavering faithfulness to his promises, and two, man's inability to nullify these through ingenuity, accident, or disobedience.
Well, the first part of that may be a little bit more difficult for people to think through. You know, how does this show God's unwavering faithfulness to his promises? Well, it does in kind of this apparently contradictory thing. God tells them that they've rejected him as king, and yet he gives them what they want. He gives them a king. Well, why would he do that? And why does he pick this particular king? As we're going to see, God picks Saul. They don't pick him. God picks him, but yet he's said to be the people's choice. And what we see is that through this process, God is showing he's, in a sense, like a parent giving a child what that child wants, recognizing that this is going to not work out well. This is not going to be good for you. So floating above that disobedience or that waywardness or giving that child the desire of his heart is the father's understanding of how I'm going to use this to teach you some lessons or to move forward my purposes for you, my instruction to you, the goal that I have in mind for you that you can't see, that you can't understand, that you can't fulfill. So this is a part of the process, the outworking of the process by which God will see that Israel's role in the world will be fulfilled. And at the center of that purpose for Israel is that they will be a royal priesthood. So this idea of kingship and a human ruler for the sake of the world is very much at the heart of God's purposes, even though he's allowing the people to take this in a direction that's not going to work out well. he's going to continue forward. He's going to ultimately give them a king who's after his own heart. And this will lead us to God's choice of David. But at the same time, we see on the other side of this that whatever may have been the good intentions of Israel or the desire to, be done with these judges, and we didn't comment on this, but the text shows that what spurred their desire for a king was when Samuel is old, his sons are unfaithful. They don't follow in the pattern of being men of God as Samuel was. And so the people of Israel are saying, look, we're done with these judges. Samuel, you're old, you're leaving. We don't want your sons to rule over us. And so there was a kind of right indignation on the part of the people of saying, we're tired of ungodly rule, or we don't want ungodly leadership. So we want to have a good king. We want to have that kind of a system in place. But whatever were their good intentions, this is not going to work out for good. And it becomes obvious in the choice of Saul and the process with Saul and even the people's relationship with him. So we see once again through this thing of the emergence of the monarchy in Israel, these twin streams of the process of moving forward in the salvation history. God will remain faithful. He will see to it that his covenant intentions are fulfilled. Israel will not be able to be Israel, and all of their choices, all of their progress as a people testifies to the fact that they cannot be what God called them to be. And so God is going to have to arise and as we say so often, cause Israel to be Israel, cause the seed of Abraham to fulfill its calling on behalf of the world.
And be to ultimately live out the consecration that God has set apart for them
Right.
and to live into that, not just in title, but to actually live that out in their hearts and truly be consecrated indeed too. So
Right.
I love that.
Exactly.
Great. We sincerely hope this time that you share with us has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast and hit that bell for notifications. We look forward to you joining us for our next episode. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.